Welcome, everyone, to the Religion Unplugged podcast. My name is Joseph Holmes, filmmaker, culture critic, and podcast host of The Overthinkers. Yes, welcome to the Religion Unplugged podcast, which is your your regular plug-in for religious news and culture. I'm here with Alyssa Plock of Alyssa's Movie Takes. Alyssa, would you introduce yourself briefly?
Yes. Hi, my name is Alyssa Plock, and I run the YouTube channel Alyssa's Movie Takes, where I do movie and TV reviews and think pieces, mostly from a Christian perspective, and particularly with a phenomenon called The Chosen. I do a lot of coverage with The Chosen.
Yes, so we are talking today about The Chosen. Oh, also, you often write for the Wallflower Journal. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So I also write for the online women's magazine called Wallflower Journal, and I do some think pieces there on movies, but I also do personal stories that turn into lessons, life lessons
Yeah.
on that platform.
You are a thoughtful person who often shares their thoughts on culture and life with the world.
True. It's true. It gets me out of my comfort zone and helps me think through my own experiences and hope that it encourages other people. And often it does. I'm always happy with learning that, what I went through blesses other people, which is
it's hard to find an objection to that. Anyway, yes, today we are talking about the season 3 of The Chosen. The finale has just come out in theaters. If people don't know, The Chosen is a multi-season TV show about the life of Jesus, directed and produced by showrunner Dallas Jenkins, most best known prior to that for the movie that name I don't remember anymore, actually.
Well, there's two that he did that I've seen. One was What If from 2010, and the other is
starring Kevin Sorbo and Debbie Ryan. Yes, and then what was the other one?
Which is his sort of ode to It's a Wonderful Life.
Right.
And I find that it's a fun movie.
Yeah, it's a fun movie. Yeah.
And then The Resurrection of Gavin Stone.
That's it. Resurrection of Gavin Stone. Yes. Yeah. So anyway,
which plays off of the whole Hollywood star in need of rehabilitation.
Yes, and the Elmer Gantry story of somebody kind of trying to scam Christians and then sort of becoming converted in the process. Anyway, yes, so it is made by him, and then it is also produced by Angel Studios, which is Mormon-based streaming service trying to create content for families. It's been going on for 3 seasons now, just finished the 3rd season, and the 3rd season, both the for the season opener and the season finale that's just come out are now were released in theaters first and did so well. The 3rd season finale just beat won the Thursday box office, getting a 1.6 million in box office receipts, beating out Avatar for the first time, which only got 1 million in receipts from the same many theaters. So so that movie, that's just come out, and of course it's now on Sunday and Tuesday the episodes premiere online. So we're gonna be talking about the season 3 of The Chosen and Chosen in general. So I gave a bit of a very brief outline of what The Chosen is. So for people who are not familiar with The Chosen, how would you describe it to somebody who is asking what the big deal of it is?
Yeah, so in the first season, and I think this translates to all of the seasons, their little tagline was #BingeJesus. So it's a streaming show made with the intent that you watch more than one episode at a time, except when the new episodes are coming out and they do the standard one at a time release. But it is meant to be the first multi-season series about the life of Christ, but it's not told exactly from Jesus' perspective. It's called The Chosen because it's told from his disciples, or as they call it in the show, his students' perspective.
Mhm.
So you're not in Jesus' head as much as you are in the disciples' heads or in the people who are experiencing his miracles or his teachings. Although you do get some screen time with just Jesus where you see what he's
Right.
going to, and it's well produced. It's not low budget. I mean, it's low budget in comparison to other TV shows, but
Right.
it looks beautiful and they have strong talent behind and in front of the camera.
Yeah, no, so it's really gotten this blown up over the last, 2 years. Sort of been,
Hey, can I touch on that a little bit of it?
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, when COVID hit in 2020, which is crazy that now that's 3 years ago,
Yeah.
The Chosen had released their first season earlier in 2019. But because there was suddenly that desert of content where nothing was being released, this was something wholesome, something intriguing that people were binging literally at home. I binged it when I first saw it, and it just has had that sort of infinity graph increase since
Yeah.
then. So it started to get in word of mouth, and now it's a combination of word of mouth plus they have a bigger marketing budget, so they're able to, they have good headlines like last night's headline, and so the curiosity around it is growing, and that you just see that with the multiplier effect that more and more people are discovering.
Yeah, well, and you're getting like articles in the New York Times and the Atlantic noticing that, oh, there's this TV show about Jesus that is not only that is getting huge. I mean, it's people are are watching it. Are huge numbers of people are watching it, and they're putting out individual episodes in theaters. There's a Christmas special that they did for it, and then in doing the opening season 3 opener and then season 3 finale in theaters, and making huge waves, getting onto the top 10 box office for the week sometimes, even though it's just a small Fathom event. That's really turning a lot of people's heads. And then recently, of course, also after the season 3 opener, Paul Schrader, who is the writer behind Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, and then the director of First Reformed, got behind it and said, this is amazing, great thing. And people are really excited because it's like, oh, this is a well done faith-based show. It's made by the showrunner Dallas Jenkins, is an evangelical Christian, and of course the people making it are Mormons, but it's as good, really, as anything else that you would see on TV. So people are really excited about that. So when did you get because one of the big things, of course, you have a YouTube channel where you talk about movies and shows, but like the biggest stuff that you've done in terms of like the things that have some of the biggest stuff you've done has been commenting and reacting to The Chosen. So when did you get involved, and when you start watching it, and when did you get involved in talking about The Chosen on your channel?
Yeah. So I did my first YouTube video in 2020, about 3 weeks before everything shut down. I ended up watching, I did a trailer reaction to I Still Believe, the Jeremy Camp one.
Yes.
And then I ended up watching the Jeremy Camp movie in theaters. And that was the last movie I saw for about a year in theaters.
Literally, my first article for Religion Unplugged was a review of I Still Believe.
Yeah, you and I have such weird parallel lives with
Yes.
when we started doing film content.
Yes.
And I started many YouTubers. I'm gonna do something with movies, but I don't exactly know what it is.
Right.
And so I reviewed The Chosen after I watched all of it in basically 2 days, because at that point
You started watching it during the pandemic.
During the pandemic, it was really easy to binge content.
Yes.
And I've never been much of a binger.
Well,
but,
and they put it like on YouTube, the channel.
It's on YouTube. And so
yeah.
they had done, I will give props to Dallas and the Chosen team that they are really good at marketing and finding niches. So Holy Week, they streamed an episode every day.
Wow.
And so leading up to Easter, I believe. And so just Christianity and the resurrection and the life of Christ are on people's minds. And it was like, hey, new content. Can't see anything.
Yes.
So I did a review of just the whole season, and then that got more views on my channel than other shows. And then the second season came out in 2021, and basically at some point it got on Dallas's radar, and so he commented on one video where I was doing a little critique of his depiction of Jesus with a particular character. And he wrote me this really long book of a response in the YouTube comments. Not a normal thing. And so I did the classic YouTube thing and made a YouTube video about that.
YouTube response to Dallas
Yes, I did a
Jenkins.
YouTube response where I kind of debated him of what he had said. And I came to the conclusion, this is okay, I can kind of see your interpretation. We'll see how you do in the next episode. And then it's just since then it became clear that people watched my channel mostly after seeing some kind of chosen content. So I've tailored it more to that. But I like doing the think pieces, and this season I did more reviews and think pieces because each episode deals with so much of the Bible.
Yeah.
That's in the Bible, or then that kind of fleshes out the characters that they're following. That's not in the Bible. We can talk about that in a minute, but it made me think, and I like teaching and learning about my faith. And so it's been fun to pass that on.
Yeah, again, one of the big things about the show for people who don't know is that, they take typically people that we know from the Bible. Sometimes they'll make up their own characters, but mostly it's taking people we know from the Bible and then fleshing them out as characters, giving them backstories that we didn't know that we could imagine that they might have, but aren't explicitly talked about in the Bible. And recently, they've been creating like minor characters or creating characters that secretly turn out to be characters we know from the Bible who are like minor characters. And then using those in order to talk about personal issues that people have with their faith that can then wrestle with the things that people today wrestle with about their faith. Because for example, in the new season, one of the big, the easy things that is that, little James, is a disciple of Jesus, and he's got a disability. He's gets to ask Jesus, well, why are you healing other people and not me? And it's a very obvious attempt to like have. Obviously, there are people who wrestle with that, who are Christians today, who believe in miraculous healings and even, believe that they've seen God do that for other people, but he hasn't done that for them, and they wonder why. And through that, telling stories like that and giving those to the characters that are in the series, you get to wrestle with those issues. So you, in a lot of your videos, like I do like a reaction to the episode, and then you will do another episode that is dealing with one or two of the issues that are brought up in the particular episode that just released. Right, and
That plays off of just my desire to engage with content that is good, but also that I can find an application for.
Yeah.
Movies speak to me in that way. I often learn lessons from movies. And so to kind of combine both of those makes sense.
Yeah.
And then also I've just found it's an easy thing to talk about where it's usually hard things to talk about. A good conversation starter for topics you wouldn't otherwise have. So for instance, I did one on how Jesus redeemed sexual brokenness and sin, which is a hard topic to talk about. But since they've somewhat addressed that in the show, I could bring that in as a conversation starter and talk about things that are harder to talk about in a faith-based setting sometimes.
Yeah. So we'll talk a bit more about that because those conversations I think are really important. So tell us about your just opening thoughts on the third season of The Chosen, because you've been following this from the beginning and now you've seen the whole thing. And so what do you think are the things that this season does well, that it retains from the previous seasons, that things you really liked about the series, and things that the maybe the season didn't do as well as it does the other series, or what were your sort of thoughts on this, being a fan of the series from the beginning?
So I have a great affection for many of the characters, and so they still maintain my affection this season. And there's certain characters who kind of know how we're going to respond in certain situations. For instance, it's well known that even in the Bible, Simon Peter, who's still Simon in this show, by the way, they haven't changed his name yet. Simon hot-tempered,
Right.
and he's a little bit of a loose cannon, and so you know that that's true about him, and yet you're getting to know him deeper in a deeper way and see what drives him, what makes him tick, what the love that he has for his wife, and marital struggles that they have together, which is props to the writers. I think they do this well because they're just pulling from real life. Dallas is an itinerant person, so he's traveling around a lot, which you are as a director. You're just going to be, and so part of these conflict scenes that they have between Simon and his wife are pulled from him coming back home and his wife having certain expectations and him having certain expectations and then misfiring. And so because they pull from real life, which is what you should do as a writer, and yet also respect the content, right? You're not forcing it on it, but it makes sense. So that's really good. One of my favorite moments from the season is straight from scripture, where it tells us that Jesus sent his 12 disciples out to do the deeds that he did. And so over the first two seasons, ending in the finale of season 2, we've met every disciple.
Yeah.
So now they're given some authority to do what they've been watching Jesus do for about 2 years. In the show, we've covered about 2 years worth of territory of Jesus' 3 years of ministry. And they did it really artistically. And to see some of my favorites, which one of my favorites is Matthew, because it's just in the show they play him as somebody who's very intelligent but also lacking in some social skills that grows as he follows Jesus, and he learns how to love in his own unique way. Yeah, but he's a little bit more of a monk type character.
Sure,
not monk.
Monk the detective from the TV show. Yes.
So
who had a OCD personality disorder.
Personality,
and so
exactly.
they do portray
he calls out
Matthew.
a demon, and it's just very cool to watch little mousy Matthew go like with his hands, just wipes it out, and it works, and it's just very cool to go, that's so cool. Matthew.
Yes. Yeah, no, again, like that for people who don't know, one of the most famous kind of creative choices made was to make Matthew, the tax collector who started to follow Jesus, to make him on the spectrum, as it were. So he seems, most people would agree, he seems he's autistic. He's, highly intelligent, but he doesn't get social cues and things like that. And it wouldn't have had, a word for that like we have back then. But it's still like, for many people, it was like, like somebody, for people who do have grown up on the spectrum, it's like, somebody like me, or at the very least, somebody I know, could have been a follower of Jesus as well. And those things don't present barriers to being part of Jesus. And of course, yes, they make them. That's, again, one of the strong things about the series is that because they're trying to do 7 seasons of the life of Jesus, they build out these characters and you can start to see them grow and develop. And you see somebody like Matthew, who has his personal issues, but also, he was a tax collector and he was betraying his people on a regular basis, growing and struggling with that reality as he's growing to be the disciple who's going to be one of the fathers of the church.
Right. And for good or for ill, and I will include this story because Dallas shares it, for good or for ill is in depending on how you view the show, I guess. Sure. But Dallas was, when he was thinking about doing this show, I can't remember if this timeline was, if this was before or after Kevin Stone sort of tanked, but he had it in his heart, and he says that he had heard from the Lord that people are going to use this show and think of the disciples as that would be what they would think of. So it's beneficial to think of every disciple as an actual human being, because the scriptures name them all, but the only ones you really have a picture of in your head are Peter, James, and John. Right. And maybe a little Matthew. Yeah. But the show is really good at helping you see these disciples and Jesus as a real human being. And I know that there are some controversies around the content.
And we'll talk about that. Yes.
You'll talk about that. But for the most part, I enjoy having that picture in my head of a Matthew, of a John, of the more minor characters like James, that they call little James because there's 2 James, and right. What it looks like with a zealot on board, a zealot with revolutionary. So I'm very appreciative to have. If you asked me the names of the disciples 3 years ago, I may not have been able to list them all. I could just give you the 10 commandments, but maybe not the disciples. But now I definitely could do the disciples because I now have a photo attached in my brain, like a directory.
So, okay. So one of yes, exactly. So one of the things, so I guess, so what you're saying is there's a lot of development that you've seen from the disciples and the characters over the past 2 seasons now, the third season. And you're enjoying seeing the flourishing of those plot lines now that we've gotten to build 2 seasons worth, seeing the 3 seasons, all of these build on that and tell new stories. Like you said, someone like Matthew, who started out so different and now is able to cast out demons.
Yes. Yeah. So there's that piece, and then because so much of the Gospels is Jesus just preaching or doing miracles, I also think that they do a good job of breaking that up.
Mm-hmm.
That every time I see a miracle, I'm seeing it in a new way.
Okay, yeah.
That's mostly been true throughout the seasons.
Yeah.
This season, in season 3, they do they tell you in the trailer they're leading to the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah.
There's a couple other big headliner miracles that are in there. Over the course of the season, we see Jairus's daughter being raised from the dead, and we see the woman with the issue of blood. But it's never just, well, here's the woman of the issue of blood, and here's Jairus's daughter. So Jairus becomes somebody that you become more known with.
Yeah.
Woman with the issue of blood gets a name and may show up later on in the series as a significant part later on if they follow a certain trajectory or certain tradition of what happens with Holy Week. So I know, and one of the things that we mentioned after having seen the finale yesterday with the woman with the issue of blood, there's a very significant moment in the Bible where Jesus says, "Who touched me? I felt power go out from me." And they do a fun dolly trick to help you get inside of what Jesus was thinking or feeling in that moment. And it's those are cool artistic moments that help it stand out, that help you really feel like you could understand more of what these people who just dropped everything and followed Jesus were really going through at that time.
Yeah, no, I mean that's always, for as somebody who like watches a lot of films, it is fun watching The Chosen to see like that they actually know some of the tricks of the trade of like making films more than just set up camera and let characters talk. Where like they'll do that black and white silent montage in episode 4. They will use a dolly zoom to represent Jesus, how Jesus feels when the power is being drawn out of him. They'll express that visually and not just have Jesus say, "Oh, the power drew out of me." They'll actually do those things because it's like these are part of the film language that have been part of film language for decades, and Christian films typically don't use them or use them effectively. And so that is fun to see. Okay, so they're building off of these things. They're doing that in a strong way. They have their formula down where they'll say, okay, there's Jesus has to go somewhere and he has to preach. He has to, and then he's got a miracle from the Bible that he's going to do. But before he does that, they'll set up these characters. In some ways, kind of like the Nest series. I don't know if you ever watched those growing up, the Nest cartoons, where Jesus only spoke scripture. It was all cartoons, and Jesus only spoke scripture. They would build out these characters they would meet. So build out the real flesh and blood people that Jesus will encounter, and then show what emotional issues they have, as well as whatever physical ailments they had, that Jesus, as what he works, helps solve for them. And so they're kind of doing that as the formula now. And also, of course, starting to build in characters that are like, okay, these are characters that are interesting and they're building out the world, but they're starting to reveal that they're actually characters from the Bible. And so, this is their backstory. And that's sort of a cool thing that they're doing now. So yeah, like again, where the season is kind of like the season is found its formula and found its footing a little bit, for good and ill, and is getting to sort of build on and pay off some of these things. Now, are there any things that you think sort of are weaker about the series? As again, we're starting to see kind of like, okay, we're kind of almost halfway through the series at this point, because if they want to do 7 seasons, and you're starting to get a picture of like what the show is it going to be? So like if people like the building out of these characters, they like, the story stuff we're talking about, like what are some of the weaker aspects of it that you think are either unique to this season or are sort of coming to gel for the series as a whole?
Yeah, so what's weaker in both season 2 and season 3 are the way that they're building toward their major moments.
Okay.
And part of that is there's a lot of I would call it dead space, unfortunately. There's some dead space there where it's just characters talking, but it's not really exciting. I don't really know why they're telling me this information. It's a lot of exposition. And in things that may make sense for the characters as how they're written, but as an audience member aren't as exciting. So the unfortunate part of not going to from miracle to teaching, because if you read the Gospel of Mark, it's only it's less than 20 chapters and it goes really fast. And all of a sudden you're at the crucifixion. And even in John's gospel, which is a little bit longer, he spends a significant amount of time on Holy Week. And so if you're fleshing this out into 7 seasons, it's sort of like when you have a franchise like The Hobbit, which is 1 book, 3 movies.
What a great comparison.
You have a lot of time to fill that essentially sometimes you would fill with filler.
Yeah.
So that's not as exciting to the audience. So that's one area. And then I just don't think they've been able to do the level of achievement that they were able to do in season 1 in the subsequent seasons, because in season 1, each of the major disciples had a conversion moment, essentially, where they give up everything to follow Jesus. But until that point comes, there's conflict in their lives that's leading them to that point. So for Simon in season 1, he's in debt. He's deep in debt. He's doesn't care anymore what he does to get out of that. You have Matthew, who's ostracized from his community and his family. You have Mary, who was possessed, and yet at the end of each episode, they're given a moment to shine. But it's all building towards something. Yeah, building toward essentially them becoming the band, right? Yes, the disciples, but they make it look like a band at the end of season 1. And so. And there's a really strong character that we lose at the end of season 1. Yeah. In Nicodemus, who is the most conflicted about the whole Jesus thing. And so not having a character who's as conflicted about Jesus, or having a arc that goes all the way through the season in as strong a way is missing. I miss it. I'm homesick for it a little bit in season 2 and 3. The season 3 does it better than season 2. Right. But the season 3 arc is actually, the season 1, I guess, could be considered extra biblical too. But season 3 is really just part of that imagining what could have happened. So yeah, I think that's fair. I think, again, I agree. I mean, season 1 was the strongest in terms of like setting up these characters with real stakes in their story, and then having Jesus, save them in ways, and then making that decision to follow him and those sacrifices that take. And that, like you said, Nicodemus being probably, I mean, I would argue that Nicodemus was the strongest character in season 1 because he was the character that had the most you said most conflicted. I think it's good, but was the most of 2 worlds and 2 minds about it, because he had so much to lose if he didn't follow Jesus, but he also was growing to be convinced that he was the Messiah. I think there's a lot in the Chosen series that's kind of boring in the subsequent seasons. I mean, I was on your show recently, and I cannot shut up about why do they constantly talking about olive groves and, buying olive groves and selling olive groves and things like that. And sometimes, again, it makes sense because they're like, oh, how are we going to support the ministry? But they spend so much time talking about those and having scenes about that where they're discussing that, where there's not clear what the stakes are. And they will often have a lot of conversations where they're not clear what the danger is, what the stakes are in a situation. And it's just plot exposition. It's just
theological preaching back and forth. And oftentimes that will eventually lead somewhere, but it's one of those things where it's like you have to sit through a lot of boring stuff that they haven't convinced you to care about in order to get there. And part of that, I think, is just, they have to do a lot of different character arcs with a lot of different characters. Sure. And not everyone is going to be as strong as the others. But I do think that, again, there is a lot of stuff that, like, the different shows that are very talking based tend to run into this, and they have to solve it in different ways. I use the example oftentimes of of West Wing and Game of Thrones, where West Wing, was a very talking show, and it was just all people talking back and forth about whatever, to save the president or get the president's agenda passed. And they had to, and Aaron Sorkin, his tradition was plays, not television shows, which were more visual medium. And in order to solve that problem, his director of the show invented the idea of, having people walking while they're talking, what they call the walk and talk. So, okay, they're talking, they're giving exposition, they're saying things that are maybe kind of boring, but they're running to go see the president, and they're doing so it feels like they're going somewhere. Or Game of Thrones sort of came up or popularized the idea of they call it sexposition, which is plot exposition while characters are sleeping with each other, which it would not be something a faith-based show would do. But again, that was their solution to how do we deal with just characters explaining the interpersonal court drama that's going on in a way we're not boring the audience. And The Chosen kind of hasn't figured out as much how to do that. Now, towards the end of the season, I think they actually start to do that fairly well, where it's like, okay, there are a bunch of stakes clearly laid out. Characters are high emotional states, but they really don't do that as much in the first season. But what they do is that every episode does lead to a character who needs help from Jesus and receives that help from Jesus. And
they've kept that up. I was just thinking out loud of formulas that work.
Yeah.
The Law and Order formula works.
Yes.
Right. There's a crime, there's the figuring out who's doing it, and then there's the court at the end, to
right.
good or ill. But I'm not sure if The Chosen would work as that formula forever, right?
Yeah.
So as SVU has worked forever, Law and Order has worked forever, Jeopardy has worked forever. Like, there's certain formulas that just work, but I don't know if Jesus showing up to another broken person and healing that person, that they're going to get healed at the end. It's tough to draw that out, because essentially as soon as Jesus shows up in the scene, they're healed.
Right. There's that's actually an excellent point. The conflict is, there's no conflict because there's no tension, because whenever he's there, it's going to happen. It's over in a moment. And so that's partly why they have to build in these things of, again, as the big story of the season is Peter and his wife, who, I don't think this is spoilery to talk about, but his wife, his marriage problems, they suffer a deep tragedy, and how they deal with the fallout from that. That's sort of the big arc of the season, and that's not in scripture. That's they don't mention Peter having a wife. They mention the disciples saying, like, we've left wives, among other things, to follow you. But they don't mention Peter having a wife in the scripture.
They do say that Jesus heals his mother-in-law.
That's true. So you would imply that he did have a wife. So that's good. But they don't talk about her at all. She
doesn't have screen time.
yes, exactly. Yeah. And so figuring that out in the series, but again, it's good because we wrestle with those things in our relationship with God. It's, why does God heal some people and not others? Which is, I think, really the big theme of this season, because it deals both with Peter and Eden, his wife's arc, as well as little James, which they set up. I think it's very interesting. They begin the season that way, answering that question, and then they deal with this with other characters throughout. But because, again, the main formula is somebody has a problem, and then they eventually meet Jesus, who solves it as soon as he shows up. There is no inherent conflict in their formula, so it all depends on them bringing in extra formulaic subplots that all have a very clear conflict Jesus can then solve concurrently to that. And sometimes they bring a conflict in that's compelling, and a lot of times they don't. So that's sort of what makes it very hit and miss. And I think, again, for a lot of people, it's going to be like, do I recommend the show to people? And it all depends on like, how much do you get a cathartic high out of seeing people in dire straits that then Jesus heals, and then we'll speak to them again. Like one of the moments that people really got the strongest positive reaction to in this season was Jesus healing the woman with bleeding, who they named Veronica, as you alluded to in this season. And for me, I watched them again. It's a beautiful moment, but I was like, okay, we've seen this moment like multiple times in The Chosen by this time. I think an even more moving version of this is the man at the by the pool. Like, I thought that they did an even more moving version of that story there personally. But this one, I mean, Jesus saying, was like, you've been rejected by others, even by your father. I don't reject you. I love you. And Jesus saying that to people over and over again, people really respond positively to that. Even though I think it's a beautiful moment, I just say, oh yeah, this is good. But other people like really emotionally hit that. And that's what they consistently do. So if that's something that like really you're going to respond to, like the Chosen will do that consistently. The other things, the interpersonal drama and the conflict with the Pharisees and the conflict that the disciples have of asking tough questions and sometimes getting answers from Jesus that are helpful. And sometimes it depends on, how you feel about the answers Jesus gives. That's sort of hit and miss in the show. Would you say, I mean, like, that's sort of my impression of watching it. Do you say that that's a fair assessment?
Yes. And part of it is that Jesus is eventually crucified.
Yeah.
Because of more the Romans step in at the last minute, but it's more of a conflict that he has with the Pharisees and the temple leaders, and you see over the course of these 3 seasons that's spreading to higher and higher powers.
Yeah.
But it's essentially the same issue, just kind of being heard by more powerful people.
Right.
So it's not really raising the stakes. And they try to do this, and I think that they succeeded in the pool of the guy by the pool, and sometimes where you can tell that Jesus is intentionally doing something to get himself in trouble, because he knows that in scripture and especially in The Chosen, it's clear that he knows where he's headed.
Right.
It's clear that he knows that he's headed to the cross. And so in The Chosen, they go to great lengths to show you, not to great lengths, but they will show you he knows what he's doing when he's doing this miracle that's going to get him in trouble, because he's pushing the block toward his ultimate showdown with these people too. So he knows that the showdown is coming, but the showdown is the same in season 1 as it is in season 2, is in season 3. It's like, how dare you? How dare you?
Right. It's hard to have hard to have a villain, like a real antagonist villain that you start out with that you can carry through, because it's like, well, why don't they just kill Jesus now? Like, how is this? So what they're doing is they're having the very little in terms of an antagonist for Jesus right now, and they're probably going to do more with this later. His confrontations are going to become more frequent and more intense, I'm sure. And that's actually one of the things I think is cool. This is me being a guy. Like, I really cool in this season is, episode 3, where Jesus goes back to his hometown. He has his confrontation with his hometown priest. I think is one of the coolest moments in the series. But
and
they
the
almost
slightly different.
Yes.
Slightly different.
Yes.
It's also, we know this guy, he makes claims there that he doesn't make elsewhere. And you're right, it just immediately makes it so intense in terms of what he was really up against. And the question, why don't they kill Jesus, is answered in a really cool way.
Yes.
Essentially, they try and they don't succeed, obviously, but they're not succeeding. It's very interesting.
Right. Exactly. So it's. I think that the series is going to become more automatically intense as it goes forward, but building tension now while you're still waiting for these conflicts to build up. Sometimes they don't a lot of times I would say they don't build that conflict in to replace that conflict that's as interesting as going forward. So yeah, I think when they do it well, at the end of the season, they have this, conflict breakout that Jesus has to come in and help and solve. That does feel like it's escalating because it's based on Jesus's fame that he's starting to grow and spread, and it's now dealing with these different sects of Judaism and Greek and Roman, and they create these characters that are interesting that Jesus can deal with, and the tense situation there that they can then not have to use again. So it's okay, they've sort of solved that problem.
What I have learned watching this show, because I know the Bible stories, I'm somebody who knows the Bible stories, and I think that they probably are doing a somewhat accurate job of this, is why Rome is such a big deal, and how they can sort of flourish as Jews in their faith despite Roman occupation, which I knew in my head.
Yeah.
But seeing it play out is that's probably new to me in this way, that the show does better than I've seen because mostly what I've seen in dramatizations is just what the scriptures play. They don't give you any cultural context, but that does make it interesting. This was not so much in this season. He shows up a little bit, but there's basically a local leader from the Romans who is not happy with Jesus, but there's still a level of toleration that's not with Jesus that's not there from the Jewish leader side.
Right.
So that piece of it is very interesting, just because you would think if anybody would be a threat, it would be Jesus to the Romans, but he seems more of a threat to the Jews, and I think that they do.
They do that. They do that well. Again, a lot, the cultural context of making this come alive as a real place is really they do that very well. And particularly, again, if you've grown up hearing sermons about this, some of this you've heard before, but if you haven't, or biblical scholarships, some of that, but you have, it comes alive in very particular ways, and they do that well. And I one of Dallas Jenkins, he's talked about this, his passions is showing how Jesus can speak to the issues of our day. And we live in a very divided time, in a very hateful time, and Jesus has the answer to that. And so you see a lot of these with, again, people who, oppressor groups and oppressed groups, and that conversation being so highlighted, and then various multicultural groups. I mean, there's again, it's a very multicultural feeding of the 5,000 situation that they show, and their attempts to say, look. That. Yeah, they make that the center of the conflict. I think that they do that very well. So yeah, I think the when the Chosen does its stuff well, it does it very well. But it is hit and miss for just people who are looking for entertainment, something that's entertainment. I think for people who are looking at it from a theology perspective and are kind of saying, how can this? I'm already bought in, and I'm using this as something to, because there's a tradition in the Christian mystics and the Jewish mystics, which is focusing on taking the scripture and adding imagination to it in order to personalize it and as a way of renewing and exciting your faith. And so there's almost a sense, I've seen people argue that this is in the tradition of that. And so many people are, watching it. I'm sort of in a weird place because I'm a Christian, film critic. And so I'm reviewing it as a piece of entertainment or art. But in many ways, people are not using it like that. They're using it as a way of almost a religious experience, not like they're using it as scripture, but we'll get into that in just a second, but using it as a way of exciting their imagination to put themselves deeper into scripture. So it's not like they'll watch it and say, I'm not really entertained by this anymore. I'm going to, not watch it anymore. It's more of a situation of no, I'm already bought in. I'm going to just use this as a springboard for theology and my own imagination and relationship with Jesus. So that's that. Yeah,
that sounds right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into some of the controversies around the show that have sort of started to get larger as the series has gotten more fame. One of them, of course, is that this is what is known as adding to scripture. It's one of the things that they talk a lot about in the Bible. Don't add to scripture, and so a lot of people are afraid. So you brought up Dallas Jenkins saying that this is how people are going to be imagining these disciples for at least, the next generation or so, which I think is right. I think that there's going to be very few people around the world in Christian communities and faith-based communities, because they're showing this around the world. It's probably one of the biggest depictions of Jesus in film that people are widely accepted in the faith-based community. Is be very few people, kids who grow up thinking of Matthew, who the picture of Matthew that they have in their head isn't going to be as a guy on the spectrum. That's just a reality. Even people who know that that's not what in the Bible, when they open up and they look at Matthew, the actor from The Chosen is going to pop into their head. But a lot of people are like, that shouldn't be the way it is. Scripture should stand on its own, and we should use it to excite our imaginations, not have our understanding of Scripture be stuff that's in our imagination that we're imposing on the text that comes from a normal human's imagination. And so there's a lot of fear that it's going to, even if it's like not technically replacing Scripture, that for many people, this show is going to be more powerful in their imagination than what the Scripture shows. So do you think that there is a validness in that fear? Or if you think, that it's wrongheaded, what would you say to somebody who thinks that that's what's going on?
Is there a validness in that fear? I believe there's a caution. You have to, I'm sorry, that's sort of the weak diplomatic answer, but
how dare you?
Yeah. It can go off the rails.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it has, but you have to be careful that it doesn't go off the rails. And right now you can go on Twitter, you can go on YouTube, and there's people that say that it has gone off the rails.
Sure.
I don't think it has. I think that their imagination they have enough checks and balances with how they're doing the imagination piece of it that I have not seen anything that's incredibly egregious or heretical that has made me stop watching the show. I had a couple episodes on my show where I disagreed with how they portrayed Jesus, but that's not coming at it from he's being heretical. It was more, this is not my experience with Jesus. But since some of that is the subjective interaction between different people with God, it's not make it or break it. It didn't make me stop watching the show. It just made me again engage in that sort of theological discussion. I don't think they've gone off the rails. I'm not sure. I definitely don't believe it's adding to Scripture, because Dallas says it's something it's just a TV show. It's essentially my imagination and my co-writer's imagination, but we are checking this.
Yeah.
A lot of it with they have a sort of a cohort of people who discuss Jewish
local scholars, Jewish and Christian
rabbi,
scholars,
priests, and scholars. So they're doing their homework and they're not just making stuff up out of thin air. They try to keep in line with what might have happened. So I would just say people love to hate on things. That is half the internet. So people will say what they want to about the show, and a lot of people aren't going to watch it, or a lot of people will watch it. I see it in the Christian Facebook where people will be like, I can't believe they did this on The Chosen, or I can't believe they did that on The Chosen. I don't believe it's adding to Scripture, because it points you back to Scripture. One of the things that not Jesus, he's not Jesus. Let me be clear. Dallas says is he's always really excited after an episode premieres, and then something that they've mentioned in the show becomes like the top search in the Bible app.
Yeah.
And I had the experience even watching the finale last night, where I have been a Christian for a very long time, and I know the Bible. I don't know all the references, but I know most of what's in the Bible. And so a friend of mine that we watched it with asked, what was that psalm that they quoted? And so I remembered enough of it to Google it and send it to her. But now she's interacting more with that psalm than she otherwise would have.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that every time they have a miracle, people will Google that miracle.
Right.
And
well, that's an excellent point to make, because
that's a good thing. He's trying to point you back to Scripture. And yes, ignite your imagination. So you're bringing something a little more visual to it than
Yeah.
maybe you otherwise would have. But at the end of the day, I believe scripture stands on its own. But let me just point that back to you because
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I think that, you asked this question, is it pulling people away from scripture, or is it giving people or drawing people further to scripture? I think is a great way to frame it. And I think the fact that we have clear evidence that when people watch the show, it causes them to go look up the things that are referenced is a clear indication that they're going back to scripture. I think that also, I think there is a certain dilutedness that using our imagination to add to scripture isn't happening anyway. Anytime that, they had this controversy back when they had the whole should we have icons controversy in scripture, and somebody pointed out that words are icons. They're images that conjure images in our heads. And so when you're reading the words on a page, you're bringing stuff to it from your imagination anyway. And if you don't realize that you're doing that's always happening, you're not realizing, you're bringing stuff to it. And so what I think shows like this do is it uses a really powerful device to, in a sense, challenge our imagination, say, oh, well, you're imagining Matthew this way. You have an image of your head of what Matthew looks like. Well, why couldn't he be on the spectrum? And that expands your imagination to include people like that within the story of the church in ways you otherwise wouldn't have. Now, obviously, and you're right, and they have biblical scholarship that they're doing it with, but obviously, you can say, you can start to associate this so strongly that you forget, and that happens anyway. But again, like that happens anyway. And my solution always to that is, well, why don't just have more adaptations that do different takes on it? It's it's like, don't not have TV shows or movies about Jesus. Just have a lot of them that portray these characters in different ways, and that challenges people to like think about the different ways in which you could interpret that. And again, it's always because like I grew up in like the comic book fanboy community, and a lot of these controversies are very much just like the ones that you see from people who like their favorite comic book superhero, like it's like the latest version of Batman that's on screen. It's like, this is not faithful to the source material, and here's why. And they just do a whole YouTube video on it. It's like, okay, fair enough. But I one thing I appreciate about The Chosen is it probably the first series that I've done that takes the scripture seriously and says we're not going to change the source material. We're going to add to it, but we're going to add things to it that actually respect the narrative structure of the story, which is Jesus comes in, he presents himself and who he is, and he works and helps people, and then they have to react to him in whatever way they choose to. And that's something that's very true to the scriptures, and that's pretty much how faithfully they've done it. And I'm actually very impressed with the Christian community that it usually hates anything that's like artistically kind of well done, because to be fair, like you have things like The Last Temptation of Christ that not only is creative but heretical, and so they're kind of used to that. And so it's nice to see something that's creative and not heretical, and the Christians are proving that they will actually respond positively to it. One of the things before we kind of wrap up, I want to deal with, of course, to see your thoughts on is that, it's not just Christians who are making this. Dallas Jenkins is an evangelical Christian, it's being produced. I mean, a lot of it is crowdfunded, but it is on the Angel Studios platform, and it is, a lot of it is funded by Mormons and by the studio. And a lot of Christians are uneasy about that because, although Mormons typically consider themselves to be Christians, most Christians do not consider Mormons to be Christians. And there is, if it's people who are claiming to be Christians but are not Christians, then, they're heretics. And having that kind of, potentially corrupting heretical influence on the show, where it's like, okay, there's Mormon money here, and therefore they have some power over what gets said and how it's presented in a way that could twist people's understanding of Jesus in a way that is not just, okay, it's Christian doctrine, but it's the areas of gray that we're not sure about and different interpretations within that. It starts to move over the Overton window to things that are outside of Christian doctrine, that are extra Christian doctrine, that's, even subtly, Mormon doctrine. And Dallas has responded to that a couple of times. But what do you think is the what do you think about his responses that he's done, the criticisms? How valid do you think the criticisms and fears are? And what do you think about his responses to them?
I haven't seen many of his responses to them.
Okay.
But in terms of the criticism, I would say watch for theological drift. I have not seen it. And it is one of these cases where Dallas comes from a lineage of strong Christians, strong evangelical Christians. And I believe that he has more of a call on his life as more of an evangelist, that he's more likely to bring people to the true knowledge of Jesus than the other way around. I see a bit of Billy Graham on him in that way. So I have not personally been concerned about it becoming Mormon in any way, shape, or form, because they're following the Jehovah's Witness is a little trickier because their Bible is so similar. They just changed a few words here and there. The Mormon Bible is just different. It's just not.
Right. Yeah. Well, and for the most part, they don't. The Book of Mormon doesn't follow like the Gospels. I mean, it's just it's a different book. It's telling different stories.
So they have a certain number of seasons that they're going to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they're going to extend it and do Acts in season 7.
Yeah.
But they're certainly following the events and the timelines of the Gospels, not the Book of Mormon. And so that seems to me to be the reason why I haven't really thought about it that much as a concern, because they're following Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and pulling from only those, other than Jewish context and Roman context, historical context. So, for instance, in many of the episodes, to kind of familiarize you with the Jewish culture, they're introducing you to Jewish holidays. So Purim is in the finale. They had Rosh Hashanah, which is the New Year. They had the Sukkot, which is the tabernacles, celebrating the time that they were in exile. And so would some Christians get up in arms that they have those kind of things, those holidays? No, I don't think so.
No.
Those disciples would have celebrated them because they're following the script of the Bible.
Yeah.
I'm not really worried about.
Sure. That's fair.
I think Dallas has enough guts to be like, no, I'm not sorry. I don't care that you're funding it. I'm not doing it that way.
Right.
I'll just go find a different distributor, because the distributor is not really the power here.
Yeah.
And it's now a popular enough thing that if he went and had to sit down with Netflix and said, hey, I need you to produce my show, but I get full creative rights, I'm guessing they would probably do it because it's a big enough show. So
that's a fair point. I think it's, for me, again, he says he has full creative control. The people at Angel Studios say, he has full creative control. They haven't told him to do anything. You're right. And you're right to point out, like, the source material that they're pulling from, is, all stuff that's in, the Christian scriptures, not the Mormon scriptures. And so there'd be no reason to put in Mormon theology in there. And I haven't seen them do that. Like, there was some question of like him saying, I'm the law of Moses, that was, a reference to Book of Mormon, but it's a very tenuous one. And I don't think it's really there. But I think you make an excellent point. Just like anything else, watch for theological drift. I mean, again, like I say, I go back to the, comic book, thing where it's like, you always watch the show and say, I don't think that that's the correct interpretation of Spider-Man. I think that's I don't think he would do that or something like that. And so you do this with watching it. If you watch it, you can say, I don't think that this is faithful to scripture or to how I think Jesus would behave. And of course, if it starts to go drift into like heretical territory, you notice that. But so far, they haven't given evidence that they're going into heretical territory.
No, there was one moment this season where I was concerned that they left a line out. So that whole adding to scripture, because I know they're going to add dialogue, but sometimes they take things out. And so when Jesus sends out the 12, they spend a good time of him actually doing the sending. They spend more time on him doing the sending than them actually showing them out in the field, because they do the montage.
Yeah.
But when he's doing the sending, he says, and if anybody rejects you, just brush the dust off
your feet. Yeah.
But I have to check if it's in all the gospels, but I'm pretty sure it is. And it says as a curse against them. And they left that one out. And so that's where I think I was like, it's not like, oh, that's it. I'm writing an angry letter to Dallas and I'm not watching his show
Sure.
ever again. I'm going to get my friends to boycott it. But it was just, that's, I don't know if that takes away from like what Jesus was intending.
Sure.
Because I think it's difficult because it's basically what we're getting is Dallas's interpretation of Jesus.
Right.
And I think you've had some issues with that because you're missing some of the mentoring piece.
Yeah.
And I'm just a little concerned maybe at times that we may miss things if certain things are taken out. And that I would go back to the point of scripture. But if you don't know scripture, it's like, oh, I didn't know that Jesus cursed them if they rejected.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that goes to sort of like the stereotype of gentle Jesus, meek and mild, who kind of doesn't curse, doesn't, have that kind of wrathful aspect to him, even though he talks a lot more about hell than he does about heaven in scripture. And to their credit, again, like he says, like wrath comes later in the episode 3. He doesn't say there's no wrath. He says that wrath comes later. Yeah, you're right. I've had one of my criticisms of this portrayal of Jesus is I'm most interested in seeing a version of Jesus as a potential mentor to young men, because I think that men need mentors today, as exampled by them all going to YouTube to find them. And I think that and we have historically had a problem of attracting and maintaining men in church. And I think that a version of Jesus I don't think the version of Jesus that they portray is attractive to men to look to as a model and a mentor. And I think that the stats about who is watching The Chosen, who's really responding to The Chosen, or at least anecdotally, bear that out. And so that's been a disappointment of mine, but also it's like that's just typical for how Christians sort of do Jesus. And so it's not doing anything worse than normal. And this is actually better than normal. But I think to your point that is inspiring people to engage with it, Christians to engage with it in an intelligent way, and for people to engage with scripture. And that's something that sort of, this will be kind of my final point on this, and then I'll leave it to you to close this out, is that, so often Christians will watch something and they'll just say, it's good, you watch it, you can accept it, or it's bad and you don't watch it. And what Dallas is actually doing, and he's doing this in like his live streams where he'll show the episode on YouTube before taking it off and putting it on the Chosen app. And he'll actually talk people through what happened in the show and read letters about it. And he's actually teaching people to, when they're watching something, to engage with it and say, I like this about it and I don't like this about it, and this is why, and this is why I thought it could be better, and this makes me uncomfortable and that's bad, or maybe this makes me uncomfortable and it's good, and engaging with it. And The Chosen, I think, invites people to say there's a lot good here and there's a lot bad here, and I can like you do in your episodes, like say, oh, here's where I think that it prompts something really positive, here's something that I disagree with. But as long as it's prompting us to lean in and engage with it in a way that strengthens us and also points us back to scripture so that we are actually going back to the scriptures, I think that, again, that's a uniformly positive thing. And if Christians can actually learn to more widely engage with art in general that way, I think that that's a overwhelmingly positive thing.
I agree. I would say where I can see it becoming problematic with the audience is more of a little bit of groupthink, where it's like the way that Dallas portrays it has to be right because it's the danger of celebrity and groupthink. So that's one of my final points. But overall, I would say for me personally, it's helped me go back and look at different scriptures a different way. Think about how Jesus would interact in a hypothetical situation that's at biblical times, but not actually in scripture. And so, would he prepare for a sermon? I think that's an interesting hypothetical. Yeah. Some people got very strongly opinionated about it one way or another, but it's a nice hypothetical to have a fun debate about too. Would Jesus prepare for a sermon? And then you could have a strong yes or a strong no. And then you're learning about Jesus and you're going to the scriptures to kind of figure it out. So I believe that it's a useful tool. I think people will come to know Christ through this.
Oh, yeah.
the nature of having a big budget for the software too, because it's so easy to get in so many different languages.
Yeah.
And I don't find the Jesus of the Chosen heretical, and I find him, I'm guessing that as they get into the later seasons in the death and resurrection, that people who have not been converted along the way may have a real, for lack of a better term, or the best term ever,
Are you going to
come to
say it?
Jesus moment.
Yes. Oh, well done, well done. I was like, oh, please let her use that word.
Yes. So I'll end there because that's
Cool. That's fantastic. Well, thank you everyone so much for listening. And of course, thank you, Alyssa, for joining. If people want to engage with more of your content, both your content analyzing The Chosen, including 1 or 2 episodes that I have been on, where can they go?
Yeah, so I go to YouTube and it's Alyssa's Movie Takes. So so you can just follow, subscribe, check out some of the other content there, Chosen, or some of the other reviews I have. And then also you can find me on Wallflower Journal. That's wallflowerjournal.com. Just search for my name. But check out some of their other content too, because it's just great. If you're a woman, it's amazing. If you're a guy,
I've
want
read
some of those fashion trends, but you're welcome.
I've read a few of those, at least to help me understand my female friends better, and that's been very helpful. So I definitely recommend guys do it for some investigative work at the very least.
Yeah, right. Why not? Do it for some investigative. Keely Clarkson runs it. She's amazing, and
she's very cool. Yeah, cool.
So,
yes, and of course, if people want to watch The Chosen, of course, it's on the Chosen app. You can download. It may still be in theaters by the time the season 3 finale, by the time this comes up, this episode is up. You can also see my reviews for all the seasons of The Chosen and other material around The Chosen at religionunplugged.com. And you can also follow me at josephholmesstudios.com, and of course my podcast, The Overthinkers, at all where you can find all such podcasts, and also theoverthinkersjournal.com. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.